Alright. Hello, it's I, Wacky Anime What If. Here to present you with What If Deku had the Life Force Life Manipulation quirk. And I hope you guys enjoy this. I did spend some time thinking of this, but it seems pretty good. Let's go ahead and get right into it though. Midoriya is very excited. He has just turned 4, and he can finally get his quirk. And he's very happy about this because he can become a hero. He knows he can. He would never give up once he's a hero. He'd save everyone he can. That's the mentality that our Zuko Midoriya has. Once he gets up out of his bed, he runs out of his room, he bolts out of it, and he knocks on and starts pounding on Inko's door. And once Inko hears this, she slowly begins to get up. So does Toshinori Yagi, and so does Izuku's sister, Izumi. When she gets up, she opens the door to her room, looks at Midoriya, and says, "What is it exactly? Why are you banging on their door? Is anything happening?" And he said, "We're getting our quirks today." And Izumi just gets up out of her actual bed, runs out of the door as quickly as possible, and just starts jumping on the door to Inko's room and starts knocking and banging also. And Inko was just outside of it, hearing the conversation, just smiling and laughing to herself, saying, "She has some energetic kids." And so does Toshinori Yagi. Gets up, goes behind her and says, "Yes, we do." And they open the door, and they look at their kids, both of them with sparkles in their eyes, and as cheerful as can be. And they get them downstairs, they make some breakfast, they make some waffles, some syrup on the waffles, sausages, some hash browns, and some eggs. Which is very good breakfast, actually, because Toshinori Yagi can really cook a really good breakfast. And once they finish making it, Midoriya walks all the way to the car, gets in the back seat immediately, and so does Izumi. Once they all got in the car, they drive off to the quirk doctor. Once they reach into the quirk doctor, they end up looking directly inside and seeing there's so many kids there. They're all going to get their quirks. They're all going to become great heroes, is what Midoriya is thinking. So is Izumi. And they see Bakugo. He just left out of the quirk doctor. And he said, "Hey guys, look." And he starts popping off some little explosions out of his hands. And saying, I got a quirk. It's called Explosions. It's the best. A lot better than you extras. And he just immediately calls them extras, which they're really offended about. Because Bakugo's their friend, but why is he calling them extras? They have to be so mean? Did he have to be so mean to them? And Bakugo says, "You extras won't even get any good quirks. Hell, you probably aren't going to get any quirks." And, well, Midoriya was quite angry. Midoriya was angry at this statement because what would happen if they didn't actually get quirks because of that? But then he brushed it off. I mean, there's no way he's not going to get a quirk. And Midoriya and Izumi both just walked in the quirk doctor because their name was called. And so as their parents walk in. Once they walk in, the doctor does tests on both of them. And he walks out saying, "Hey, I want to give you the good news or the bad news." And they're like, "What's the good news?" And they say, "Izumi has a quirk, and it's called gravity manipulation. She can manipulate every aspect of gravity." And they're really happy about this, and they say, "What's the bad news?" And the doctor says, "Your son seems to have a quirk, but it's not there. It's not there at all. Like, literally, there's no quirk, but it shows that he had one. Or he has one. We just don't know what it is. And we honestly don't know if it's actually there or not." And once they heard this, they didn't really think much of it, because, well, they already have their star pupil daughter, Azumi. So they pick up Azumi, they start piggyback riding her. They start walking out of the hospital, and Midoriya is trying to catch up to them because they're not slowing down for him. And he gets in the back, just barely gets in the back seat, and they don't even really notice he's in the back seat. They kind of forgot about him the entire time. Once they drive off, they go into the house, and Izuku is about to go in. They close the door in front of his face. And Izuku is stuck looking outside on the grass, having to sleep there, while simultaneously having looked through the window, seeing how they're praising Azumi. They're lifting her up in the air, they're giving her cake, they're giving her all these really good food. There's really good food, and they're saying she can become a great hero. And she asks, but what about Midoriya? What about Izuku? And they say, who's that, honey? And Midoriya feels heartbroken. He was completely forgot about. And Midoriya just straight up sleeps in the front yard. He gets up once the sun starts pouring down on him. And he ends up getting up, getting his little book bag he had on, and going to school. When he goes to school, everyone notices he's covered in leaves and mud. But they don't really notice too much aside from that. And they figured he might have just tripped somewhere. They don't really know the fact that he's had to sleep outside of his house because his parents didn't really remember he existed. And the fact that it was raining, so when he was sleeping outside in the grass because it was soft, the mud kind of smeared all over him. So, yeah, they just asked him what his quirk was and how did he get so muddy. And he said, oh, my parents locked me outside. And they all laughed at this, saying, oh, that couldn't have happened. And he just says, oh yeah, also about what my quirk is, I'm currently quirkless. And once that reached his lips out, he wished he would never have said that. Because once that happens, Bakugo looks at him, laughs, and says, I told you you'd be quirkless, you Deku. And this sets Midoriya off. He was just called useless by one of his best friends. And the worst part about this is that while everyone's taunting him and bullying him, physically beating the shit out of him, in the middle of class, by the way, and the teachers aren't doing a thing. They're actually encouraging it. They're saying, go beat that quirkless kid down. He has no life, no right to live. And they're saying all this stuff. And Azumi is literally just watching this happen. She ain't doing a damn thing. She just is like, oh, well, it doesn't matter. Not me. And she sees he's being brutally beaten. Nothing. She just ignores it. And this is how the whole day goes. He's beaten in the middle of class, beaten to the point to where he'd be bloody, broken, and he'd pretty much have multiple dislocated bones or shattered bones. Because some people who had a hardening quirk hardened their skin and hardened their bones and started punching him in the chest over and over, nearly causing Izuku to die before the teacher pulled him off. And they didn't really reprimand him, they just pulled him off so he wouldn't die and it wouldn't be on the school's hands. This would happen over the years. Course of a few years, this would happen. He'd be beaten over and over by his classmates. He'd be nicknamed the useless punching bag because he could never fight back. Even when he tried, they were too quick for him. They either had speed quirks, physical enhancement quirks that literally if he punched them, all it would do is break his wrist. And every time he asked for help, well, the teachers would turn a blind eye to it, or they'd just tell the people that were bullying him, oh yeah, your victim just tried to ask for help. I suggest you beat the shit out of him more so he doesn't say anything and becomes very docile. And they wouldn't really take his complaint seriously because he's quirkless, and his parents haven't come forward because, well, they don't remember him existing. His mom and dad didn't remember him at all. Izuku had to literally have all the cash that he had on him, and he had to make a spare key to his house. So he'd be in his room, in the back room of the house, and it would be very moldy, and it would also have a leak to where some water would be in, and it threatened to submerge him. They never really checked that room, though. They kind of forgot that room existed. Hell, one time they almost sealed the room off with cement because they were redecorating the house and they didn't know what that room was for. They almost sealed the room off with Midoriya in it. It was by sheer luck that they didn't. And Midoriya had to deal with all this his entire life, all the way up until the beginning of the anime. Once he was about to go into his middle school, the last day of middle school, and Midoriya was like finally out of this hellhole. But honestly, even if I get out of this hellhole, I'll probably just end up in another one. He'd always have this type of thinking, this negative thinking, after a while. He tried to always think positive, but, well, when the positives never work, the negatives always work. Is what he says, at least. And while he's going into his classroom, everyone's looking at him, and they're all wondering how he should beat him up today. It's the last day, might as well make it really special. And some of them are contemplating whether to get Bakugo to use some of his explosions on him, and then beat him down with their spike quirks, because some of them actually puncture into his body. About 99% of Midoriya's body is full of wounds or scars. There isn't a single area in his body that isn't full of scars except for his face, because that would leave physical evidence. Anywhere else, and they could just blame it on something else. Yeah, so while he was sitting down in the back room, the teacher just walks in, has a sly smile, and says, "Hey everyone, I don't even need to pull out these aptitude tests because I know you all want to be heroes." And he throws the papers in the air. And he says, "Also, there are 3 students applying to UA. One Bakugo Katsuki, one Azumi Yagi, and one Izuku Midoriya." And once it reaches Izuku Midoriya, everyone looks at him, and they don't laugh at him. They don't do that. They get up, every single person in class gets up, goes to the back of the room, pulls him out of his seat, and they start brutally beating him down. And the teacher even goes back there and helps. Provides them with rulers, provides them with pencils to stab them with, even provides them with drinks and snacks if they get tired of beating the shit out of Midoriya. Midoriya is currently being beaten so bad that he's nearly dying. You can see his eyes flashing before his eyes, before his life flashing before his eyes, and he notices something. That's all this is happening just because he's quirkless, all because they think that he's useless. What if he proves them all wrong? And he's wondering how he will, while he's being beaten, because he doesn't really feel the pain anymore. It's gotten so bad to where you can't feel pain. Because when you get used to something so long, you tend not to notice it. It's not that he doesn't feel it, it's just he doesn't notice the pain. He currently has 15 broken bones and a few dislocated ones. Specifically, his fingers are dislocated. 3 of his fingers are dislocated. His right leg is currently bending the opposite way. And his nose is completely fractured. And his skull also has a fracture. While his lungs were currently beaten and battered by some people. And the inside of him looks more like you know when someone puts a piece of candy under a tire and they run it over and it crushes? It's kind of like that on the inside of Midoriya right now. And he had to go to the recovery office. Once he goes in, there's this one woman that says, "Aren't you tired of getting the shit beat out of you? Shouldn't you just go ahead and, file some complaints or something?" And he says, I've tried. They don't listen. I'm quirkless. They don't really care about quirkless. And she says, well, then why don't you just move schools? Because you're making it so difficult for me. I'm going to treat you every single day. And she just merely uses a quirk and heals him. Heals him quite efficiently, but still leaves physical scars on him. And Midoriya doesn't mind this at all. Because, well, these scars are a little bit of a semblance of his rage, of his anger, and of how he'll get his revenge later on. Because he's always been thinking about revenge. He usually would think about how do I become a hero and all this stuff, but after all these years of them beating the crap out of him saying he can't become a hero, he still wants to, but he doesn't exactly desire to become the best hero or anything. He desires just to become one. Because, well, his entire ego was broken down to where he won't become the best hero mindset, just become a hero. And he merely gets up. He walks out of the nurse's office. He goes down to the bridge, down under a bridge while he's going to the long way home. And he hears something, but he just ignores it. Because he's probably thinking, it's just one of the bullies again trying to beat the crap out of me as soon as I leave school. And he looks behind him and says, don't you guys ever get tired of the... And then he notices this giant slime villain right in front of him. This giant sludge wrapping around him. And also grabbing onto his limbs, twisting it slightly. But just enough to where you could hear a crunch in his bones. And just so you could see it twist almost completely off. And Midoriya was being covered in sludge. It was blocking off his oxygen, but unlike the past Midoriya who would have struggled through this, he didn't struggle at all. He merely just literally let all of the sludge go into his lungs. He didn't care. Until he heard, I am here! And his idol came crashing down and punched directly towards the sludge villain, blowing it off of him. Midoriya, who was still barely conscious, got up, looked at All Might, and said, can I become a hero? And All Might immediately says, no, you cannot. And he said, why not? And All Might said, because a hero would not be that defenseless. What are you, quirkless or something? And Midoriya says, actually I am. And then All Might just says, you definitely can't become a hero then. You'd be too powerless, you'd be a liability, and honestly, your entire existence to society is a liability. And Midoriya is very depressed by this. And he looks at All Might and says, and you call yourself a hero after saying this? How has the world fallen? And he looks at him with pure rage in his eyes, pure hatred towards All Might, because that was the last straw he had. The last straw inside of his very being. Because he always looked up to All Might, looked up to his smile, but he realized it's all fake. It's all just broken by design, kind of like the society. And while he's thinking this, he doesn't really notice, but All Might is staring at him, trying to figure out who he is exactly. Because All Might doesn't know who this guy is. I mean, he didn't really know who his own son was. And once Midoriya left his sight, All Might was still trying to piece it together while jumping away. And then he remembered, wait, I had a son known as Izuku Midoriya. Wait, why did I forget about him? And then he started remembering, because he was quirkless, he forgot all about him. He forgot his existence, he forgot he existed, he forgot he lived, and he forgot every detail about him, ever since he was 4, and doesn't know how he was surviving or anything. And All Might started to feel a wave of guilt go back to him, and then he started trying to go backwards, trying to find out where Midoriya was. And once he goes back, he sees Midoriya being pierced through the chest by, well, ironically, by the same villain that All Might had just caught. Because All Might was so caught up answering the question on the kid, he forgot to even bottle up the villain. And the villain went back and just merely killed the kid, because he couldn't use him as a bodysuit. Because when he tried to use him as a bodysuit again, it didn't go well. Because the kid was already full of bruises and injuries. It's a shock he survived so long. So all of that the Sludge villain did was just stab him through the heart with one of his Sludge tentacles while sharpening it. And All Might walked in on this, saw Midoriya's lifeless corpse being dropped down from the tentacle from a very high altitude and plopping to the ground. And he could hear a wet sound from inside of Midoriya's corpse. And he could see tons of blood leaking from him. And All Might ran up to him, lifted him up, and said, wake up, kid. And he started slapping him on the cheek, wondering if he could wake up. Is he okay? And he started looking at the Sludge villain. He immediately punched him one time, and he blew up into bits. He bottled him up very quickly, and he started running to the hospital with Midoriya. Midoriya was placed inside of a hospital which was known for some questionable things. But All Might didn't have time to think. So when All Might put him in the hospital, he was in critical condition, and he was in intensive care. He was still alive, just barely. They don't know if he's going to pull through the night. And All Might was relieved. He went home, and he told his wife, "We've been ignoring Izuku for way too long. We need to welcome him a part of the family once he gets back." And Azumi also notices this. She starts to break down and she starts to cry. Because they all forgot he existed. Or they just ignored him. All because he was quirkless. All because of one silly little thing. But little did they know they wouldn't have that chance anymore. They already had too many chances, and, well, fate has another thing in mind with Midoriya. Midoriya is inside of his hospital bed, and it's at nighttime, and he looks in the corner of his room, because he's barely conscious, but he sees this dark figure in the corner of his room, saying, "Do you want to live?" And Midoriya merely utters one word, "No." And the figure says, "Well, too bad." And he walks up closer to Midoriya, and grabs him by the neck and twists it, killing Midoriya instantly. The next day, Midoriya is declared dead. And they noticed the fact that his neck was twisted. But they also noticed the fact of all of his injuries. And they probably thought that, well, his neck might have been one of the injuries, but they didn't diagnose it properly. They tend to do that with quirkless people. They tend to give diagnoses not as serious. They usually just let them die later on. And once All Might and them caught wind of this, they all attended his funeral. Azumi was crying in tears into All Might's shoulder. All Might was crying into Inko's shoulder, and Inko was crying into all of them. And Bakugo even attended the funeral. Bakugo didn't cry, but he wasn't exactly happy. He was gritting his teeth and wondering, was this his fault? And he just walked away. And once they all walked away, a figure in a suit walked up towards the coffin. Then, once it was nighttime, he walked up towards the coffin. He opened the coffin after digging it up, and he put his hand over it. And this dark aura came out of his hand and went into Midoriya. And Midoriya sprung back up and opened his eyes and looked in front of him and asked one question: "Who are you?" And the man answered, "I am all for one." And that's where I end this. I hope you all enjoyed.